We're here today with AMM member Doyle Reid. Thanks for coming to the museum and visiting with us today.
Certainly, it's an honor.
Good. Well, first of all, I wanted to ask you, how long have you been a member of the American Mountain Men Association, and what initially drew you to it?
Well, the AMM is kind of the premier organization of a living history personnel of the era that we're talking about, of the fur trade. So I had been involved with groups like this in the past, but about 15 years ago we decided to start a new chapter of the AMM in the Wind River Mountains, because the Wind Rivers were so important to the trappers of the day. We thought we should have a party in the wind. So myself and 3 other guys got together, and we're the founding members of the Wind River Party.
Great.
Of the AMM, which has allowed us to participate in a lot of events only open to members and guests. So it's been a great experience and a way to further my knowledge of the lifestyle of the period.
Great. Well, can you give us some information? We're talking today about how a lot of these men that had never been to the mountains before, they came primarily for a job, right?
Yes.
So why was this such a draw for some of these men to come to the Rockies when they had never probably even heard about them before?
Well, the first draw, I think, is going to be for financial gain. When the Lewis and Clark expedition returned to the United States with stories of all these furs and all the animals, the riches to be found in the mountains, that started drawing people there. Entrepreneurs such as Ashley and Henry advertised in the newspaper for young men to join this. And I think the impetus was for adventure, of course, but hoping to get some financial gain out of this.
Yeah.
So a lot of young men, a lot of them in their teen years, with no experience to speak of, signed up and headed west to the mountains.
Great. So would you say that this was advertised as being a well-paying job?
I think it was hinted at, and I think that was the general understanding. I think they found out soon that was probably overstated. But,
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm sure that was a draw.
So a lot jumped on the bandwagon for
Yes,
that, huh?
yes.
Well, great. So what were some of the dangers that came with the job? And do you think that most of the men were prepared for this, or even knew about what they were going to experience?
I think very few of them really knew what to expect. As far as being prepared, a lot of them had come from frontier backgrounds. They're familiar with firearms, familiar with living in the woods and things like that. But the specific challenges of doing this occupation in the Rocky Mountains, I think, was an eye-opening experience to a lot of them. Some of the dangers, one of the biggest dangers, and probably one of the largest killers, was the environment itself. Hypothermia, freezing to death, things like that. Infections, there was no medicine to speak of, although they did say that meat didn't spoil in the mountains, so they were pretty healthy as far as that. Stampedes, falling over cliffs. And then the one thing that may be a little bit overemphasized, but was a real danger, was from the native peoples who lived here. There were certain tribes who were always friendly to the whites, and these were the tribes that the men took wives and such with as years went on. There were other tribes that were sometimes friendly if they needed something from you, but if you were to encounter them by yourself out on the plains, you might be in trouble.
Yeah.
Then there were other tribes who were always hostile, and the Blackfoot especially. And there were a fair amount of the trappers, of the men who worked for these companies, who were killed by Indians out here. You get wild animal attacks, grizzly bears in particular. There were people that were gored by buffalo, things like that. So very dangerous. A lot of the men came out here, spent a year, and decided it wasn't for them, and returned to the settlements. Although most of them, if they lasted a year or two, made a life out of it.
Wow. So those are definitely the troopers then, if they
Yes,
stuck to
yes.
it. Great. So all that being said, do you think that today, people looking for a job, knowing all of those factors, do you think that people would be as willing to go into the fur trade?
I think people are so much more well-informed nowadays, and we're spoiled with heating and air conditioning and things like that. But there are a small percentage of men, and I'm happy to say a lot of them are in the AMM, who live the lifestyle to this day, still trap for beaver. Not all of them full-time, but several weeks at a time, enough for it to learn the skills. So there are individuals in our society today that could probably survive and maybe even enjoy a little bit the rough lifestyle. But for the majority of us, it's a way to get out and learn these skills and live the lifestyle just occasionally as a break from our modern life.
Yeah. So would you say that there's definitely a difference doing that as a job versus just working in an office job? Is it more enjoyable?
Being in the woods and such. Yeah, and I think that's why we do this as recreation. Recreation is a luxury we have nowadays that they didn't have back then.
Yeah.
This was a lifestyle. we can work our regular jobs and be able to go for a week at a time. Horseback travels or trapping, living in the woods and stuff like that. So where it's kind of recreational for us to get away from the modern lifestyle. I think there's a big draw.
Good. Are there times where it's still a challenge to live that way, even if it is just for recreation?
It is, and you're always learning, and I think that's one of the biggest draws to the AMM, the American Mountain Man Organization, is by living this lifestyle, even if it's just a weekend or a week or 2 weeks at a time, you're learning new skills all the time. Some things that we take for granted, other things that you never use in your modern life. But there's always that challenge there. There's always that learning curve. And sometimes it's tough, but it is rewarding to keep these skills alive that they would have practiced on a daily basis back then.
Well, you said that, so obviously a big draw for most of these men to come join the fur trade was financial gain.
Yes.
Would you say that most of them were successful in that endeavor?
I would say most of them were not successful in that endeavor.
And why was that?
What you find is, as they came out here, and trapping beaver was the occupation, beaver was the main draw. Beaver was worth a lot of money, obviously, that's why they sent these brigades to the mountains. So the men would, the more successful ones, actually make quite a bit of money in their day. But what you'll find is the company that you worked for was also the company that supplied your goods. They would have an annual rendezvous once a year, and the majority of them were held right here in the Green River Valley, really close to where Pinedale is, foot of the Green River Mountains. They would have an annual fur trade festival, if you want to call it that. We call it the rendezvous nowadays. The traders would come up from St. Louis, and on the back of the mules, and sometimes a few wagons, they would bring all the goods that the Mountaineers would need to survive the upcoming year, and take in trade the beaver that they just spent the year trapping. So what happened is, even if you had a small fortune in beaver, by the time you traded for your goods to survive the next year, you're going to find it took everything you made to outfit yourself for another year.
So a lot of them just broke even most of the time.
Nowadays we call it living paycheck to paycheck.
There you go, yeah.
And the price of beaver fluctuated with the market. In years that it was up, well, correspondingly the companies raised the price of the goods also. So most of the time you were lucky to break even. You were lucky to trap enough beaver to trade for enough supplies to supply yourself for another year. So even the ones who came out here seeking financial gain decided that they enjoyed the lifestyle so much, even if they weren't making the money, they decided to stick it out and spent their lives out here.
Yeah. And is that why the majority of them, even after the fur trade, they went into guiding? And
Exactly. That was their life. And what you find is, in the pursuit of beaver, these mountaineers is the term I use now. They're trappers, they were camp keepers, hunters, guides, interpreters, clerks, the traders. There were a lot of occupations in the mountains, but basically they were all there to support the trappers.
Yeah.
But you'll find is that once the beaver trade kind of went away, the price of beaver went low enough where it wasn't profitable for large parties to go out and trap anymore, the men tended to stay out here. A lot of them had married into Indian tribes. There were no white women out here at the time. So if you wanted a wife and a family, you got with your friendly neighborhood tribe that was friendly to you, not one of those that always fought you.
Yeah.
And you were able to take a woman of that tribe and live with them. So they had family out here, and a lot of them stayed. But because in their pursuit of beaver, they had explored every mountain pass, every river crossing, places where there were forage, places where there were fresh water. They knew this country like the back of their hand from the trapping days. So as the immigrants, the covered wagons, started coming across, who knew nothing about survival out here, a lot of the mountaineers were able to guide the immigrants coming across. Again, they knew places to avoid where the water was alkali, is going to make your animals sick.
Yeah.
The easiest passes through the mountains. How to treat with the native tribes, which most of them were friendly, but the immigrants come across didn't have an understanding of the relationship. So the mountaineers were very valuable as guides. Then right after that, the military started coming out. Jim Bridger in particular hired out the military, helped them, took them by the hand basically, led them across the mountains, pointed out spots that would be good for them to build forts and such. So,
great.
And eventually a lot of them ended up going west and settling in the west, but very few of them, after they'd been out here for a few years, did return back east. It wasn't their life anymore.
So would it be safe to say that a lot of these mountaineers that went into guiding, they made more of a living than when they were in the fur trade?
I don't know that that would be true, and I think at that point they probably weren't in it for the money,
Yeah,
if we want to
it's
use
more
that
for
phrase.
enjoyment.
It was a way they could stay out here. They could stay
Okay.
with their native families. They could spend their time in the mountains and plains like they always had. Financial gain, very few of them really turned out to
Yeah.
profit from their time in the mountains.
Now, I know there's a couple that they say did make.
Yeah, there were a
good
couple
living.
exceptions, and you're going to find the ones who did fare really well financially were the ones who got into the management part of it.
They're more businessmen
They
rather
moved
than
up, yeah.
mountainmen.
Jedediah Smith is a real good example, and he's known for, I should say, his lack of excesses. He didn't abuse alcohol. He didn't do a lot of those things. He saved his money. So in a few years, he lived very frugally in the mountains. In a few years, he was able to buy a partnership in the company that he worked for and was able to move up in the hierarchy. Robert Campbell, William Sublette, same way, started out as trappers, but were able to leverage that into a position in management. And even some of the lower men there, Charles Larpenteur came out here as a trader, as an employee, but he didn't drink, he didn't engage in a lot of partying and things like that.
Didn't blow his money.
Didn't blow his money foolishly like most of them
Yep.
did. And same thing, he was able to buy into a fur company and become a partner. But the majority of them, the Rendezvous has got a reputation nowadays as being this big, wild, drunken party, and it probably was. But you have to remember that these are men that have been for a whole year, because they only get supplied the annual once a year, have gone without alcohol, have gone, looking over their shoulders, expecting an arrow from the bushes, grizzly bear, buffalo, all these challenges, the cold, the numbing winters.
They were all pretty isolated
wading
too.
through, the loneliness, wading through rivers to set traps. Well, now for 2, maybe 3 weeks out of the year, they all come together in a central spot. They have access to alcohol. They have access to foodstuffs that they are not going to get, coffee, tea. A big treat was raisins. They didn't have anything sweet to eat,
Wow.
so even raisins were a big one.
Yeah.
But what you'll find is after the excesses of this 2-week or so, 3-week revelry, that from there they have to leave and start planning their fall trapping company. And pretty quick, the coffee, the sugar, the things like that they just traded for runs out. So the majority of the year, they're living on creek water and roast meat.
Wow.
So yeah, they did kind of overindulge for that short period, but that was just a break from the monotony and the hardship of their normal lives.
Yeah, we can't blame them.
Yes.
Well, great. Well, can you tell us a little bit about your gun? Is this a common gun that one of these fur traders would have used for hunting?
That's exactly right. This is a replica. We leave the originals in the museums for future generations to study. A gunmaker friend of mine took about 200 photos of original in a museum, and because I wanted an exact copy. If a mountaineer would have shown up at the annual rendezvous, say down here on Horse Creek, and say crossing the river he dropped his rifle and lost it, maybe he broke it, it could have burst, anything could happen, he would have to have replaced it at that rendezvous. This is representative of one of the guns that we can document was actually traded there.
Great.
The American Fur Company contracted with the Henry factory. This is called an English pattern. There were a couple other patterns. This was the second most common pattern in the mountain, and dozens of them came out every year for trade. This one was built as an exact copy, the 42-inch barrel, inch across flats, 58 caliber, walnut stock. Even the brass hardware was cast off an original.
Wow.
So this is as close for us to carry as they would have carried at that time. So this is just a typical working man's rifle, nothing fancy, but this is what they would have been carrying.
Yeah.
There were other choices. There were smooth bores. Later on, they developed a percussion ignition, but this represents what your average trapper
Great.
would have been carrying with the
So,
mountains.
can you sum up kind of what was the importance of having a gun?
Yeah.
Working out in the mountains?
Yeah, this is something that in our modern lifestyle we don't think about. But of all the accessories to survive out here in the mountains, I'm going to put the rifle, or at least a gun. Some of them were smooth bores, and I'll tell you the difference in just a second. But this was something that they depended on daily. Not only, again, we talked about food that was available at Rendezvous for a very short period. The rest of the year, it's like you go home to your wife in your teepee, your native wife, and say, honey, what's for dinner? She's going to say, well, it's a buffalo if you go shoot one.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to eat, you had to hunt.
Yeah.
Buffalo, obviously elk, antelope, deer, horse if it got that bad. But you had to have a rifle to feed yourself, number one. Also protection, whether it's from some of these native tribes who don't appreciate you trespassing in their territory to take their beaver, or from a wounded grizzly bear or something like that. You had to have it for protection. So to feed yourself and protect yourself, to survive out here, you had to have firearms. There were a couple other uses that people overlook. If a man got lost, usually either the people looking for him or him himself, if he still had his gun, they would fire the rifle and they would know, okay, there's a white man over there somewhere. So it would be a way to locate people who got separated. Because this is a flintlock ignition, it makes sparks, so you have a way to make fire right here. You get out of trapping, you're wet, hypothermia, maybe you lost your fire kit, you've always got a way to make fire right here. So you could signal with it, you can make fire with it, protect yourself, hunt with it. This is the single most important accessory you can carry in.
So they would have gone through pretty much anything to keep that on them,
Yes,
huh?
yes. When you had to go behind a tree to relieve yourself, you would take your rifle with you.
There you go.
Yeah, you didn't. If you left it in camp, you were just asking for it.
Yeah, I bet.
And generally, this is how they carried all their accessories: to shoot, clean, repair your firearms. You've got gunpowder in here. You've got the lead round balls and all your accessories carried in here. So they're kind of self-contained. As long as you had your gun and your shooting bag,
You're doing pretty good.
you had a leg up on survival.
Good, good. So I guess one last more question for you. What would you say, in your opinion, is the importance of people getting out into the mountains today, even if it is just for recreation, to go and explore and live kind of like the mountain men did?
Yeah, recreation, again, that's a modern luxury that they didn't have back then. But to get an appreciation for the mountains, even if it's an appreciation for the hardship that they had to endure, you look at the Mountaineers' lifestyle versus, say, a modern backpacker, what I'll call a modern mountaineer versus that. For warmth, we have to carry heavy wool blankets and buffalo robes. We start our fires with flint and steels, things like that. So it's very rudimentary, it's very primitive, but there's a satisfaction in knowing how to do that.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot of modern shortcuts, which are great, but this is a way to get out and recreate and learn skills and appreciate what our forefathers did. So, we can use the same mountains that everybody does now and kind of get a little bit different experience out of it. And like I say, it's recreation, but I think there's a value in the knowledge that you gain and the confidence in yourself.
Definitely.
And it's a lot of fun to dress like
It is
this.
fun. I bet. Well, thanks so much for coming today.
Certainly.
Having an
Thank
interview
you
with
so
us.
much for
Definitely.
asking me. I've enjoyed it.